Hydrogen peroxide has been used in gardens for a very long time, but not always for the reasons most people think. A lot of videos treat it like a miracle cure. It isn't. It won't fix every plant problem, and in some situations it won't help at all. But there is a reason experienced gardeners continue to keep a bottle nearby year after year. Not because it's powerful, because it helps them make better decisions. Many common garden failures begin underground, inside containers, or in the soil long before the plant looks sick. By the time the symptoms become obvious, the gardener is already behind. That's where hydrogen peroxide becomes useful. Not as a magic solution, but as a tool that reveals hidden problems, interrupts failure patterns, and buys time to correct conditions before they become expensive. Today we'll look at the situations where experienced gardeners still use it, the mistakes they avoid, and why so many modern gardeners spend money treating symptoms while missing the real cause underneath. Once you understand that difference, the way you look at struggling plants may change completely. Item 1. Why experts never wait for visible failure. Most gardeners think plant problems begin when the plant starts looking sick. The yellow leaf gets noticed. The wilted stem gets noticed. The slow growth gets noticed. But by the time those signs appear, the real problem may have been developing for days or even weeks. That difference is one reason some gardens seem to recover from problems quickly while others struggle through the same issue all season. When long-time growers walk through their garden, they are often looking for things that don't seem important yet. A section of soil staying wet longer than normal, a container that suddenly feels heavier after watering, a plant that is growing but not quite as vigorously as the others beside it. None of those things look dramatic, none of them feel urgent, but they can be early warnings that conditions below the surface are beginning to change. And this is where hydrogen peroxide becomes interesting. Many people think of it as a treatment, a bottle you reach for after something goes wrong. But one of its biggest advantages is that it can help you respond before visible failure becomes visible damage. The mistake is assuming that a healthy-looking plant is always a healthy plant. Sometimes the roots are already stressed. Sometimes oxygen levels in the soil are dropping. Sometimes conditions are becoming favorable for rot and disease long before leaves begin sending a signal. A gardener who waits for proof often ends up treating damage. A gardener who pays attention to conditions has a chance to prevent it. That is the real difference. Not experience with products. Experience with timing. And once you start looking at the garden that way, a simple bottle of hydrogen peroxide stops being a cure and starts becoming part of a prevention strategy. Because the biggest losses rarely begin the day a plant collapses. They begin the day something changes underground and nobody notices. One of the clearest examples of that happens with root rot. Item 2. The root rot decision most gardeners miss. Imagine you walk outside and find a tomato, pepper, or cucumber plant drooping in the afternoon. Naturally, most people assume the plant needs water. The leaves look tired. The stems look weak. The plant appears thirsty. So they water. Then they water again the next day. And sometimes the plant gets worse. That seems backward until you understand what may actually be happening below the soil. Root rot often develops in conditions where roots are receiving too little oxygen. The soil stays wet for too long. Drainage becomes poor. Air movement around the roots decreases. As those conditions continue, roots begin to weaken and decay. The strange part is that the visible symptoms can look almost identical to underwatering. The confusing part is that the plant can look thirsty while the soil is still wet. Both observations can be true at the same time. The leaves droop. Growth slows. The gardener sees a plant asking for help. But the roots may already be sitting in conditions that are limiting oxygen. That visual contradiction is what traps so many gardeners. They respond to what they can see instead of what the roots are experiencing. That is the decision mistake. You can see this most clearly in containers. Two plants can receive the same amount of water. One pot drains freely, the other stays heavy and wet for days. The second plant may be the one that wilts first, even though it has more water around its roots. Hydrogen peroxide can be useful here because it temporarily introduces additional oxygen into the root zone as it breaks down. In some situations, that may help support stressed roots while you address the underlying problem. Notice the important part of that sentence. While you address the underlying problem. Hydrogen peroxide is not the entire solution. If drainage remains poor, if watering habits stay the same, or if compacted soil continues trapping moisture, the original pressure on the roots remains. Many gardeners become frustrated because they use the right product but keep the same conditions. The result is predictable. The plant may improve briefly, then decline again. The more useful question is not, what should I add? The more useful question is, why are the roots struggling in the first place? That shift changes everything. Instead of reaching for another bottle, you begin checking drainage. You begin paying attention to how long water remains in the soil. You begin noticing which beds stay wet after rain and which containers drain slowly. Now you're solving causes instead of chasing symptoms. And once you start thinking that way, another hidden source of plant problems becomes much easier to recognize. Because sometimes the problem doesn't begin in the soil at all. Sometimes it begins before the plant is even planted. Item 3. The container contamination trap. A surprising number of garden problems arrive from the previous season. Not through the weather, not through insects, through containers, trays, and tools. Think about how often a seedling tray gets emptied, stacked in a shed, and reused months later. Or how often pruning tools move from plant to plant without much attention. Everything looks clean. That's the problem. The containers most likely to be reused without a second thought are usually the ones that look perfectly harmless. Yet tiny traces of fungal spores, disease organisms, or other contaminants can remain behind. Then, spring arrives. Fresh soil goes into old containers. New seedlings are planted. For the first few days, everything can look fine. Then one tray begins thinning out. A few seedlings collapse at the base. Another tray started in a cleaner container keeps growing normally, and a gardener wonders why young plants seem to struggle right from the beginning. The frustrating part is that the current season gets blamed for a problem that may have started last season. That is why sanitation remains such a consistent habit among experienced growers. Not because it is exciting, because it prevents invisible problems from getting a head start. Hydrogen peroxide is often used as a simple cleaning tool for this reason. It may help reduce contamination on surfaces before those containers and tools return to service. Again, notice the pattern. The benefit is not dramatic treatment. The benefit is interruption. A problem is stopped before it reaches the plant. That is a very different kind of gardening decision. Most people focus on rescuing plants. The better opportunity is preventing the rescue from being necessary. A clean container may not look impressive. A sanitized tray may not feel like a major achievement. But when seedlings emerge evenly and continue growing without early setbacks, the payoff becomes obvious. The garden starts cleaner, the season starts stronger, and the odds of fighting preventable problems become much lower. What's interesting is that this same prevention mindset appears even earlier in the growing process, before roots, before leaves, before seedlings. It can begin with the seed itself. Item 4. The seed germination advantage. Most gardeners think planting is where success begins, but in many cases, success begins before the seed ever touches the soil. Anyone who has started seeds regularly has seen it happen. One tray emerges evenly, Another tray from the same packet struggles. Some seeds sprout quickly, others lag behind or never emerge at all. The easy explanation is bad luck. The more useful explanation is preparation. Hydrogen peroxide is often used before planting because it may help create better starting conditions for the seed itself. If you've ever planted 2 trays from the same seed packet and watched one emerge 3 or 4 days ahead of the other, you already know how valuable an early start can be. Those few days often mean stronger seedlings, earlier transplanting, and less competition from disease during the most vulnerable stage of growth. That's why some growers care less about germination percentage and more about germination speed. In some situations, hydrogen peroxide can help seeds absorb moisture more consistently while reducing surface contamination pressure. What matters for the gardener is the decision behind the practice. Instead of treating germination as a gamble, you begin treating it as a process that can be influenced. That shift may seem small, but it changes how you approach the entire season. A strong start often creates stronger roots, more uniform growth, and fewer setbacks later. Of course, preparation is not a substitute for proper temperature, moisture, or seed quality. A poor seed is still a poor seed. Bad conditions are still bad conditions. But when the basics are already in place, small improvements at the beginning often create benefits that continue throughout the season. And that brings us to an important limitation. Not every problem can be prevented before it appears. Some conditions only become visible after the plant is growing. The question then becomes whether the symptom you're seeing is actually the problem you're trying to solve. Item 5. When leaf disease is already too late. A gardener notices white powder on squash leaves, or dark spots spreading across tomatoes, or patches of discoloration appearing on plants that looked healthy a week earlier. The instinct is immediate. Find something to spray. Find something to stop it. Find something to fix it. Sometimes hydrogen peroxide becomes part of that response, and in certain situations it may help reduce surface fungal pressure. But here's where many people get frustrated. The spray works for a while, then the problem returns. That happens because visible disease is often the final chapter of a process that started much earlier. The expensive mistake isn't losing one leaf. It's losing 2 weeks treating the wrong problem. By the time many gardeners realize the environment is causing the disease, the plant has already spent valuable energy trying to survive. The spots on the leaf often feel like the emergency. In reality, they may be the receipt. The environment created the problem first. The leaf is simply showing you the bill. That distinction matters, because once a gardener understands it, the decision changes. Instead of asking, "How do I remove this symptom?" they begin asking, "What conditions allowed this symptom to develop?" Hydrogen peroxide may help address part of the problem, but it does not replace spacing plants correctly. It does not improve airflow. It does not prevent every future outbreak. The most effective growers usually treat visible disease as information, a signal, a warning, a clue. The leaf is telling you something about the environment around it, and once you start viewing symptoms that way, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Hydrogen peroxide keeps showing up in successful gardens for a reason, not because it solves everything, because it helps people respond to conditions instead of appearances. At this point, you may have noticed something strange. Every successful use of hydrogen peroxide we've discussed has one thing in common. The product wasn't fixing the visible problem. It was helping the gardener discover the invisible one. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. How many plants are gardeners treating correctly while diagnosing incorrectly? Because some of the most expensive failures in the garden aren't caused by disease. They're caused by something most people never think to check. Oxygen. Item 6. The soil oxygen problem. nobody sees. When plants struggle, most people think about three things: water, fertilizer, sunlight. Those are all important, but there is another factor that receives far less attention: oxygen. Most gardeners never see this problem happening. The soil may look healthy from the surface. That doesn't mean the root zone is healthy underneath. The soil looks wet. The plant receives water. A finger test may even tell you there is moisture near the surface. Yet the roots may still be struggling underneath. A plant can receive enough water and still behave as if it needs more. That sounds backward until you remember that roots need oxygen as much as moisture. And when oxygen becomes limited, a surprising number of problems can begin to appear. Growth slows, leaves discolor, plants lose vigor. The symptoms often look similar to other common garden problems. That similarity creates confusion. A gardener sees poor growth and adds fertilizer. The plant continues declining. A gardener sees yellowing leaves and increases watering. The condition gets worse. The visible symptom points one direction. The actual cause points another. Hydrogen peroxide is frequently discussed in relation to oxygen because of how it breaks down after application. For stressed root zones, that temporary oxygen release may provide short-term support. This is one reason hydrogen peroxide keeps showing up in gardens that struggle with wet, oxygen-starved soil. Not because it replaces better drainage, because it can reveal a problem many gardeners never think to check: the root zone itself. A healthy root environment matters more than many gardeners realize. You can have good fertilizer, good plants, good intentions, and still struggle if the root zone remains stressed. That realization often changes how people evaluate their garden. Instead of asking what product to add next, they start asking what condition needs improvement. Drainage, soil structure, compaction, water management, those questions usually lead to better long-term results. And they also expose the biggest mistake people make with hydrogen peroxide itself. Because even the right tool can disappoint when it is solving the wrong problem. Item 7. The biggest mistake: using hydrogen peroxide for the wrong job. One of the most expensive mistakes gardeners make is assuming a successful use automatically becomes a universal use. A product that helps one problem can create disappointment when applied to 5 others. Hydrogen peroxide is one of the clearest examples. Its biggest failures often happen when people keep using it after the original condition has already changed. The problem starts when a successful use becomes a habit instead of a decision. That is the mistake many gardeners make. They discover a product that worked in one situation and begin applying it everywhere. When the results disappoint, they assume the product failed. Often the diagnosis failed. A gardener dealing with drainage problems may keep treating symptoms. A gardener facing poor sanitation may focus on fertilizer. A gardener struggling with disease pressure may never correct airflow issues. The wrong problem receives attention while the real problem continues growing. Hydrogen peroxide becomes useful only when it matches the condition being addressed. That is why some gardeners see impressive results while others see very little change. The difference is not usually the bottle. The difference is the judgment behind the bottle. Once you understand that, every earlier section starts fitting together. The value was never in knowing more uses. The value was knowing which use actually matches the condition in front of you. Because when the diagnosis improves, nearly every decision that follows improves with it. Before we finish, it is worth pausing for a moment. Gardeners are often encouraged to think in products. Some gardeners spend hundreds of dollars solving problems that began with a drainage issue worth fixing for free. The result is a growing collection of solutions without a clear understanding of the problems they are meant to solve. Hydrogen peroxide stands out because one bottle can appear to solve several different problems. But those problems rarely have the same cause. One product can have several useful applications, but no product replaces observation. No product replaces judgment. No product eliminates the need to understand what is actually happening in the garden. That mindset often saves more money than any individual treatment ever could. Here's the easiest way to know whether hydrogen peroxide belongs in the situation. If removing the underlying condition would solve the problem by itself, then the condition matters more than the product. If improving drainage solves the issue, drainage was the real problem. If sanitation prevents the issue from starting, contamination was the real problem. If airflow stops the outbreak from spreading, airflow was the real problem. Hydrogen peroxide may still help. But now you know where the real leverage exists. And that's exactly why experienced gardeners continue using it differently than everyone else. When people talk about forgotten garden tricks, they often imagine secret formulas or miracle solutions. Most of the time, the reality is much simpler. The practices that survive for decades usually survive because they solve practical problems. Hydrogen peroxide is one example. Not because it fixes everything, not because it belongs in every situation, but because it can be useful when matched to the right condition. The gardeners who get the most value from it are rarely chasing shortcuts. They are paying attention. They notice changes earlier. They ask better questions, and they make decisions before small problems become large ones. The brown bottle matters. But the real advantage is knowing what condition deserves it before the plant pays the price.